so coming to this gender segregation. Gender segregation is really an innovation in Islam. Okay. There is no such thing as gender segregation the way it is believed today. So let me just clarify what I'm saying. Now, Islam promoted modesty. Now, one could argue that there is some basis of some level of kind of parameters that Islam has taught. And that is true, it has. So, for example, when men and women would pray in the masjid, the women would make their rows, the men would make their rows, the women rows would be behind the men's rows. So one could argue that that was a level of parameter that was being placed, and that is true, that these kind of things did happen like that. Otherwise, generally speaking, there was no segregated space. That's what I mean by segregation. I don't mean, so let's say if people had to line up and men stood on this side and women stood on this side, that kind of, if you want if you want to call that segregation, I wouldn't personally be calling that segregation, because that's not what people generally understand by. But if that's what you mean, then yes, that did occur. Things like that, like when people had to line up or do things, men may have stood on one side, women on one side, that kind of stuff, but no space segregation. So the space was always shared between the genders. So let's say we're in this room now, if men and women would be here in this room. It wouldn't be like, okay, this room is for men, that room is for women. It wouldn't be like that. This is an innovation in Islam. It's a bid'ah that people have come up with because they feel they are more pious than the Prophet himself. And it's very unfortunate that not only, that people have this kind of attitude, but this attitude has become so prevalent that to question it is, a person questioning it becomes, he starts to doubt himself. That's how certain everybody is about these things. So in the Prophet's time, from the holiest of sites, think about it, the holiest of sites was the Kaaba and the Prophet's mosque. Now, according to the Malikiya, the Prophet's mosque is above the Kaaba, according to the school of Medina. But nevertheless, whichever one you go with, both of these are considered deemed the holiest of sites within Islam. Now, both of these sites had shared space. There were no barriers. There were no curtains. It really is not rocket science, and I find it insulting to assume that this is something that the Prophet could not think of. I find it an insult, an indirect attack, and maybe a naive belittlement of our Prophet to assume that our Prophet could not think of, like he didn't know, I know I could put a barrier in front here. Like this couldn't occur to him. This needed more genius to be born yet, in the latter generations. That is stupid. I think it's an insult and an affront to our religion and faith. To say the other thing is to say, in the Prophet's time. So this is one level of argument. The other argument is, in the Prophet's time, everybody was so pious and they were like angels. That, once again, is just not true. Nobody claimed that. The Prophet never claimed that about his time. You have to remember, in his time you had all these treacherous people amongst the Muslims. You had hypocrites, you had traitors, you had people that were planning with the neighboring tribes to butcher the people. There was a lot going on. These people were not like some kind of, that the city was not a city of angels per se. They were normal people. They had some really amazing people, amazing companions amongst the Prophet. And you had amongst his people around the Prophet, you had hypocrites around the Prophet as well, who were planning to assassinate the Prophet. You had people who were planning on attacking the Prophet. So a lot was going. It wasn't just like, there's only good people around the Prophet. The Prophet himself said, you had all these munafiqeen and things like this. Nevertheless, so this argument that there were only pious people around in the Prophet's time just is not true by any standard. The sub-argument to this is that even though they weren't that pious, some people amongst them, but the level of al-wazi' ad-dini, which they might say in Arabic, is like the kind of the social consciousness to which serves as a kind of a detriment, a kind of like a preventative measure, like the atmosphere. What I'm trying to say, al-wazi' ad-dini, is like the religious atmosphere is such that even if you wanted to do it, but the atmosphere doesn't really allow it. This is nonsense as well. Because how do we know this? Because people did have sexual intercourse, they did have zina during the Prophet's time. People even came to the Prophet and confessed about committing zina. There's a man who came to the Prophet and said, well, this woman came selling things to my house, I called her in and I groped her sexually and we did this and that. So these things were happening in the Prophet's time. It's not that these things weren't happening. So that argument has to be put to rest as well. And the other argument is that, as things got worse, the companions then, or people after the Prophet, had the religious ingenuity to bring up these rulings. So the Prophet's wives said, or other people said, look, times have got worse now. The truth is that in some way, yes, one could argue that obviously from a barakah perspective, from a blessing, that obviously the Prophet was no longer amongst them. From an Islamic perspective, you could feel that, we've distanced. But from a moral, objective perspective, the truth is people have always pretty much been the same. They've never really just, people before Islam came were horrific. They were doing things like burying their daughters alive, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ, that, when the buried girl is asked, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, in the Quran, that over what sin were you murdered? This was the kind of the mujtama', the society in which the Quran and Islam came. So it's not true. And then I feel that this is to show that the Prophet couldn't tell. By saying this, we're assuming that, the Prophet couldn't tell that, by the way, when things get worse, start building barriers in mosques. So I disagree with all of those things. I think they're all insulting, even though the people saying them are not intending to insult our Prophet, but I think they are inadvertently insulting the Prophet. They're insulting his intelligence, they're insulting his message. So no, there should be no such thing really as barriers in any place to segregate the genders. As to just a general natural separation within a space, then that's fine. I mean, there's no harm in that. If that's what people mean by segregation, as in, like I said, if people were to line up and men lined up on this side and women on that side, that kind of thing is not a problem. But to put barriers. The other thing I wanted to say is that in the Prophet's time, there's actually a hadith. And a lot of people are neglectful of this hadith. The hadith in which the Prophet encourages, for example, he encourages there to be like a bit of space between the men and women's rows. As in the men's rows that they end here, let there be like a gap of one row or if not a bit more, and then the women's row. And why does he say this? Because in the hadith, because men, what they would wear, you see, back then, men would wear, they would have these kind of like shirt versions of a shirt, and they would wear an izar. An izar is like what we call in Urdu like a dhoti. Okay, so it's a sarong kind of thing, like a lungi, a bit like a lungi, except a lungi, a lungi is just, something all sewn together, stitched together, so you kind of step into it. But a sarong, like an open sarong that you kind of wrap around. This is, in Arabic, is called an izar, okay, like a dhoti. This is what the Arabs would wear. Now that, as you can imagine, a sarong is actually wrapped tight around the waist area, naturally. Otherwise it'd be a bit useless. Right, so the thing is that when they would go into sujood, because of it being so tight into and remember, many men would not have anything to wear on top. Or that was their culture as well. So many men would just be bare-chested, things like this. So they would just have a kind of sarong on. Now, when they were in sujood, some of the women, they've said that, we could see the very clearly, ostensibly, the outline of the genitals, okay, and the testicles and things like this. So they could see that quite. I don't need to go into graphic contours, but you get the drift, right? So this is a perfect scenario in which the Prophet could have placed a barrier. You see, the Prophet could have said, that's not right, so I'll tell you what, let me place a barrier in between. So, but he didn't. And the women were saying they could see the contours, the definition, one might say, of the private parts of men as they were in sujood. My point of saying that is that the Prophet still did not intervene by saying, right, barriers and things like this. So in all honesty, these are an innovation in Islam. I don't support these kind of things. I think we need to kind of grow out of this insecurity, and it has created a majorly perverse society, people. Somebody said Mufti is clearly pro. Alex said Mufti is clearly pro free mixing. What the hell is free mixing? Like making music tapes. You know, if you replace the words with actual words, the real words, not just your made up words. The real words are shared space between the genders. Now all of a sudden you realize how dumb it sounds. How dumb does that sound? This is the ridiculous. Look, listen. In the Prophet's time, unless you think, whoever's saying this kind of stuff, that they're more pious than the Prophet. In the Prophet's time, from the marketplaces, you name a place in society, from the marketplace to the haram of Mecca and Medina, to the sanctuaries, the sacred sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina, from the marketplaces to them. And every space in between, including them, was shared by both genders. In the Prophet's time, the mosques had no barriers. Men and women prayed together. They could see each other. They spoke to each other. The marketplaces were mixed. The Kaaba was mixed. Masjid al-Nabawi was mixed. Do you think that the Prophet, you're so intelligent that the Prophet could not think of placing a curtain? That this idea it could not appear to the Prophet. I mean, that is, to me, it is absurd to suggest that. Of course the Prophet could suggest that. Did he? No. If you're going to tell me, well, that's because no hanky-panky used to go on in the Prophet's time, that is as dumb as the first suggestion. I would just say dumb meets dumber. Of course, they were human beings. They had all kinds of people. Of course these things were going on. You've got narrations of them going on. You've got incidents of them going on. You've got several incidents. You've got the famous incident where the person comes to the Prophet and says, he says in certain narrations that he just had sex out of wedlock. He says that in certain riwayat. And what does the Prophet say? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He says to him, and the person's kind of remorseful for what he's done. And the Prophet says to him that, have you prayed? And he says, yes. And the Prophet says, well, praise and atonement. And obviously this is going to have people now going, oh, isn't it meant to be killing the person? But you see, this is that hadith, is it not? This is and I know some riwayat where he doesn't fully explain what he did. Because he says, oh, I did something, I transgressed. And in some they say, oh, he didn't actually have sex. But Ibn Hajar brings the other riwayat where he actually says that zinait, I did zina. But okay, look at the other riwayat if you're going to ignore that one. The woman that was selling. And you see, look, this is women economically being self-sufficient, being tradeswomen, women of trade. They were a woman who was selling things. She's going around, the popular hadith, she's going around selling things. And she goes to this, she's selling it door to door. And she comes to this person and he says, well, he says, Mash, ahlan wa sahlan, ahlan wa sahlan. He says, Sara, andar to aaye, andar aaye. He says, oh, that's interesting. Selling, why don't you come in and I'll take a look? And and innocently the woman comes in. So as soon as she comes in, he's like, he can't hold himself back, and there's the fondling and the sexual, although in that particular incident he doesn't have sex, but he has all the sexual the fondling and kissing and things like all of this. And then later on he feels bad and he goes and tells the Prophet, and the Prophet tells him that, look, a similar kind of thing where he tells him, have you not prayed? You see, and in that particular case the Prophet does tell him that, I hope she's not he says, like, he does say something which makes the person feel even worse, because the Prophet says, I hope she's not the wife of a soldier who's gone out, and this is how you are behaving, and reprimands him. But the point is that these people existed. I'm just trying to give examples where this was. It's not, in case you think, oh, they were a society that had no sexual desires, and they only pray Salatul Tahajjud. The children just come on their own. The storks just bring the children. So the point is that, yet did the Prophet say, let's draw a curtain? No, he did not. Because the Prophet ﷺ is the one who brought us this deen. Not you, and not your dad.